two sisters sat curled into the shadows of the garage, their thin bodies pressed together, the air damp with the smell of oil and concrete, their whispers almost too soft to hear the older one trembling, yet fierce her arm around the younger one. Her voice cracked with fear when she said, "Can you take her instead of me?" The man who found them stopped in his tracks, his polished shoes echoing on the cold floor. He had never expected such words to slice through the night. The sound of his own breath seemed louder than the silence that followed. He was Andrew Blake, a man whose name filled glass towers with respect and envy, a man who carried power like a weapon, and yet in that moment he was nothing but a stranger before two frightened children. He had been walking through the parking garage as he always did after another endless night at the office. His tie loosened his briefcase heavy with contracts, his mind dull from meetings and arguments and numbers that meant wealth for many but life for none. He had not smiled in years. Not truly, the divorce had hollowed him. The skyscraper apartment with its glittering windows had become a cage filled with shadows. He walked every night through the empty garage to the sleek car that cost more than some houses, and still, he felt like he had nothing until he heard the sob, a small fragile sound that broke through his numbness. He followed it, and there they were, two little girls huddled against the concrete pillar. The older, one perhaps 7, holding tightly to the smaller one, her thin arms wrapped around like armor, the younger maybe 4, her cheeks streaked with tears, her lips trembling as she clutched a torn stuffed rabbit. Their clothes worn, their shoes scuffed, their eyes wide with fear, but behind the fear in the older girl burned something fierce, something that said she had carried far more than any child should carry. She looked at him and spoke again. "Can you take her instead of me?" His chest tightened, like a fist around his heart. No courtroom, no betrayal, no financial ruin had ever made him feel such helplessness. He dropped to one knee, lowering himself so his face was level with theirs. His voice softer than it had been in years, he told them. He was not here to take anyone away. He told them no one was leaving behind their sister tonight. He pulled off his coat, wrapping it around their shivering bodies. The younger one whimpered, but did not pull away. The older one stared at him, suspicious. But curious, she whispered her name, Emily, and then after a pause she whispered her sister's name, Sophie. He carried them up to his penthouse, the place that had always felt like a museum, more than a home. Now suddenly alive with the sound of small footsteps and hesitant voices, he gave them food, cereal, and milk at first because it was all he could manage, and blankets too big for their tiny frames. He watched as exhaustion overcame them, their eyelids drooping, their breaths slowing until sleep claimed them on his couch. He stood over them for a long time, wondering why two children were alone in a garage at midnight, wondering how his life had shifted in the span of an hour. His phone buzzed. Messages from colleagues, lawyers, friends, warning him not to get involved. They said it was dangerous. They said he should call the system, let social services take them, let the law decide. But he could not erase the memory of Emily whispering, "Take her instead of me." He could not forget Sophie clutching the rabbit like it was the last thing keeping her alive. He thought of his mother long gone, who used to tell him kindness matters most when you least expect it. He turned off the phone. The next morning he stumbled through breakfast, pancakes burnt, cereal spilled milk. But Sophie laughed a little for the first time, and Emily watched him with a gaze that softened only slightly, as if she wanted to trust but had been betrayed too many times. He learned that their mother, Julia, was missing, hurt, taken somewhere by a man named Rick who had been cruel, who had threatened to take Sophie away, and Emily had promised herself she would never let that happen, even if it meant offering herself instead. Andrew felt a weight heavier than any corporate empire pressing on his shoulders, yet instead of turning away, he leaned into it. He bought them clothes, crayons, notebooks, toys. He filled his sterile penthouse with color and sound. He learned to cook properly, not because he enjoyed it, but because Sophie smiled when he made shapes in pancakes. He sat awake through nightmares when Sophie cried out. He sat beside Emily when she finally dared to speak of her fears. He called on Monica, a friend in the police force who had once trusted him when no one else did. She helped him trace Julia until they found her battered in a hospital bed but alive, her eyes fluttered open. And when she saw her daughters again, tears spilled down her bruised cheeks. She whispered, "Thank you, though." Her voice was too weak to hold the weight of her gratitude. He promised her they would be safe together. He promised her she would never have to face Rick again. He moved them to his coastal retreat, a house that had stood empty for years, a place by the sea where the air smelled of salt and freedom. He turned the cold rooms into warmth filled with laughter, crayons on the walls, the smell of cookies in the oven, though often burnt. Julia healed slowly, her strength returning with each sunrise. Emily and Sophie ran along the sand, their laughter chasing away ghosts. Andrew felt his heart breaking and mending at once every time he watched them. His board raged at his absence. Shareholders demanded explanations. Friends called him foolish, reckless, wasting his empire for strangers, but he no longer cared. He had lived with fortune and emptiness. He preferred this chaos of love and belonging. Yet the shadow of Rick still lingered. Phone calls that ended in silence. Cars seen too often near the house. A note left on the porch with words that chilled them. Soon the storm outside mirrored the storm within. Andrew braced himself for the inevitable. It came one night, the sky black with thunder rain lashing against the windows. The power cut out, the house plunged into darkness, and on the porch, muddy footprints smeared across the boards, Rick pounding at the door, his voice snarling, demanding to take what he called his. Andrew stood with nothing but a flashlight, his body shielding the family. Behind him, when Rick lunged, the door nearly splintered, but headlights cut through the storm, police sirens blaring, Monica's voice shouting, "Rick, stop," blue lights flashing, rain pouring down. Rick dragged away in cuffs, screaming curses, while Julia clutched her daughters. Andrew stood soaked in rain but unbroken. The court came quickly, Julia trembling but strong, Emily holding tightly to Andrew's arm, Sophie gripping her mother's hand, Monica steady beside them. They told the story of violence, the nights of hiding, the fear that had carved itself into their bones. The judge listened, and when justice fell, it was like sunlight breaking through after years of storm. Rick was gone, the chains broken. Their life by the sea became different. The house filled with drawings taped to walls, cookies that burned but were eaten with laughter. Mornings of pancakes, evenings of stories. Julia stronger with each passing day, Sophie fearless again. Emily slowly learning how to smile like a child. Not like a soldier. Andrew watched them and felt something bloom inside him that he had thought long dead. He had risked his fortune, his reputation, his ordered life. But in losing it all, he found something richer than any wealth. He found belonging, found love. He found family. Sometimes he sat on the porch at night, Julia beside him, their hands brushing the waves crashing against the shore. The girls chasing fireflies, their voices bright against the dark sky. He thought of the man he once was, empty in a glass tower, counting victories that meant nothing. He thought of the night he heard the sob in the garage. The words, "Take her instead of me." And he knew that was the moment his life had begun again. He was no longer afraid of darkness, no longer alone, and every breath he took was filled with the weight of love and the light of belonging.